all were talking during the research with me about trying to understand what resources are available to you, and I met Greg through another colleague of his at GAO, and realized that there's so many resources out there that oftentimes aren't really made available, and just there's so much that's knowledge created from different agencies, and we kind of thought this would be a great opportunity for GAO to come and not just only share with you some of the work that they've done and some of the more interesting reports of the year, but also have him engage with you in some dialogue and some information sharing on some of the most recent reports. The speaker today is Gregory Wilshu, who's the Director of Information Security Issues at GAO, where he leads cybersecurity and privacy-related studies and audits of the federal government. He has over 30 years of auditing, financial management, and information systems experience. Prior to joining GAO in 1997, Mr. Wilshu held a variety of public and private sector positions. He was Senior Systems Analyst at the Department of Education, as well as posts within North Carolina Department of Environment and the U.S. Army Audit Agency. And with that, I hand it over to Greg.
Thank you, Parm. I think I want to kind of behave a little bit like Bobby this morning and take leave of the stage from time to time and walk around. Probably not in between the tables as much as she did, like Phil Donahue used to do, but I just really want to thank Parm for allowing me to speak today on the work that we do. I think we provide a different perspective than perhaps some of the other speakers that will be here before, from a couple of reasons. One is that I work for GAO, and GAO is part of the legislative branch of government. We are not part of the executive branch. And so all the work that we do within GAO is basically to meet the needs of our clients or our customers, the Congress. And just about all of the work that we do at GAO is either requested by a committee or the congressional leadership, or is mandated by law. We do very little self-initiated work in terms of our audits, our studies, and our analysis. And so that's kind of important to us in one respect, is that we are kind of in tune to some degree and plugged into the interest of Congress. And that's often through our interactions with their staffs, as well as the requests and mandates that they send our way. The other reason why I'm a little bit different in the views that I'll be presenting is that, for the most part, your other speakers are operators. The ones are policymakers. I come from the accountability community. I'm basically an auditor. And so we look at things a little bit different, but we still have the same goals in mind in terms of helping the operators, the policymakers, the federal agencies, particularly in the case of GAO, in performing their engagements, their jobs, accomplishing their missions more efficiently and more effectively. And that's kind of the viewpoint that we come from, to make sure that our role at GAO is helping to make federal government more accountable and efficient for the benefit of the American people and the U.S. Congress. So if you have any other questions about what we do, that's the other thing. In my presentation, I tend to be pretty informal. Please raise your hand and we'll address it right away. I will also have a few questions at the end that I kind of like to ask from you, because I do want this to be more of a dialogue and some kind of a discussion on various different issues that are of import to you as well. Today what I like to do, yes, all right, good, starting right off. Slide one, perfect.
You wanted a discussion?
Yes.
So everybody that I've met that's had access to the classified threat briefings that I know nothing about has taken the position that we're already hacked. The bad guys are already in, and we just need to learn how to live in that posture. How do you feel about this take?
Well, without traipsing into the classified realm or information for today's discussion, I think it's probably safe to say that there are persistent threats that are consistently trying to attack, or I shouldn't use the word attack necessarily. There's different terms of art, that are being used in the community. One is computer exploitation, being able to exploit vulnerabilities in order to gain information. And that is a risk and a threat that federal managers at the agencies need to address and in order to protect their systems. And that helps to underscore the vital importance of being able to sufficiently protect your information on a risk-based basis. Now, you're Peter, right? No. Yeah, from NIST. We do a lot of work with NIST and in terms of using their information, their criteria in our reviews and engagements. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but certainly, you know, it is a real threat in terms of bad guys out there seeking to gain unauthorized access to our systems and, more importantly, our information for whatever purpose that they may have in mind. And I'll go through, I have a chart in a couple slides to just kind of help underscore that point to a degree. But thank you, Peter, for asking a question right away, because I really do like the interaction much more than me droning on. And I also understand that the only thing separating you and lunch is me. So the more we interact, the quicker I'll be able to get out, I'll be able to meet your needs as far as my presentation. And so today what I'd just like to do is just go through a few slides giving you a snapshot of federal information security. One of the things that we do, in particular in my area on information security, is that we also kind of provide a unique perspective from the, at least within the accountability community, because the scope of our work can be government-wide in looking at emerging trends or emerging threats perhaps, and looking at emerging policy issues that are intended to help inform the Congress in the discharge of their responsibilities. Our work also can focus in on an individual agency to look at their information security program and how they're protecting the systems and information under their purview. And we also go down and drill down and do detailed technical control reviews over specific systems, networks, applications. And so we kind of have this breadth of experience both across government and even beyond that, because much of our work in looking at cybersecurity and the protection of critical infrastructure, cyber-reliant critical infrastructure, takes us out into the private sector and the interaction between the federal agencies such as Bobby's agency, DHS, and how it interacts with the private sector in protecting critical infrastructure. And so I think in some respects it gives us a unique perspective in looking at information security across the federal government. And then what I'll do is just, I just picked out a few recent reports that we've issued and just briefly go through some of the highlights of those. But in my slides I'll list most of the reports that we've issued over the last year. Again, we're just trying to make this information available to you. If any of the other topics might interest you, they are available at our website. And then I'll briefly go over the reviews that we're currently working on or plan to over the next year, and this is somewhat reflective of the interest of Congress in this area. And then I have a couple questions I'd just like to throw out to you in order to help facilitate a dialogue. So any questions so far? Okay. The first slide is based upon the work that we and the agency IGs have conducted in terms of looking at the security control weaknesses over the systems and information at the federal agencies. This information is based upon the 24 CFO Act agencies, or the agencies covered by the Chief Financial Officers Act. And these are your larger agencies within the federal government. All told, they probably comprise about 95% of the government's balance sheet. And of this slide, what it shows is that for each of the 5 areas that GAO particularly classifies and categorizes control weaknesses or controls, that the agencies have weaknesses in pretty much all of them, or most agencies have weaknesses in each of the 5 categories. The first category deals with security management, and this closely aligns to the 5 and 6 or 7 components of an information security program that agencies are required to implement under FISMA. You know, their procedures and practices for assessing risk, for developing, documenting, and implementing controls that reduce that risk to an acceptable level, as well as developing system security plans, providing training, testing and evaluating the effectiveness of their controls and taking remedial actions over their known weaknesses. And the IGs and GAO have identified weaknesses in most of those activities at the agencies. The second category relates to access controls. And these are just quite simply those controls that are intended to prevent, limit, or detect unauthorized access to an agency's systems and information. We break that category down into a number of categories, including boundary protections, particularly those like firewalls, how agencies design and implement, configure firewalls, routers, switches, the use of intrusion detection devices on their networks to look and protect the boundaries of their networks, looking at their user identification and authentication controls, and the controls that they establish for granting access to individual users, audit logs, monitoring, and we even include in this area physical security, because physical security is another key aspect of protecting information and the computing resources at a particular federal agency. We also look at configuration management, which is how well agencies configure these devices, assure that only authorized programs and devices are installed on their computers, and also to ensure that patches are installed in a timely manner and other such activities. And then we have two other areas that we look at in terms of segregation of duties, which is a control just to ensure that the activities of one individual or one group can be used to offset the risk associated with the activities of another. And finally, contingency planning is the fifth area that we focus on during our reviews and in which we classified IG reviews. The next slide is based upon the work that GAO and the IGs do in terms of our audits of agencies' financial statements. And in the financial statement review, the auditors are required to opine or at least to test and assess and conclude on the effectiveness of an agency's information security controls over their financial systems and information. And what this slide shows, it kind of gives a relative measure of just the significance of the vulnerabilities that have been identified by the accountability community. In this case, of the 24 agencies, 5, I better look over here, 5 show that there were no significant deficiencies in these controls over their financial systems and information. The previous slide dealt with all types of systems and information. This slide deals strictly with financial systems and information. But 19 out of the 24 agencies reported either a significant deficiency or material weaknesses in their information system controls for financial reporting weaknesses or financial reporting purposes. And material weakness is the more severe or significant of these types of weaknesses because it could potentially have a material impact on the information and the accuracy of the information presented in an agency's financial statements. This, from the previous year, was a little bit better and a little bit worse. In terms of fewer agencies having no significant deficiencies, it was worse last year or the previous year where we had only 3. This year there were 5 that had no significant deficiencies. However, 2 additional agencies had material weaknesses compared to the previous year. Yeah, that was for that's significant deficiencies. And those represent those weaknesses which management should take action on to correct, should be notified of those vulnerabilities. Could have an impact on data in the financial statements, but it won't rise to the level of materiality. Getting to Peter's point earlier, what this next slide shows, and this data we just have right now, it's just through fiscal year 2010, is that the number of reported security incidents reported by federal agencies has increased over 650% from fiscal year 2006 through fiscal year 2010, going from about 5,500 to over 41,000, or about 41,000 reported security incidents. In some respects, this rise could be due to better detection and better reporting on the part of the agencies. It can also reflect the better, or just the increased and evolving nature of the threats to federal systems, and that there are additional attacks that are out there, or exploitation attempts to gain access and to gain access to federal agencies. Now, systems. Now, these are successful security incidents, and yes.
But just if you correlate that with loss of capability in the systems, for example, we're seeing more malware or whatever on the systems, but the systems aren't going down and it's reacting and fixing itself or whatever.
Right, and that's the next slide will kind of show, it breaks out what these security incidents are. And you're right, as I go to the next one, it kind of shows that the majority, not the majority, but I guess the largest group is for malicious software being installed on computers and networks. The smallest one, which is getting to your second point, I believe, is about 1% actually deals with service disruption in terms, so much in terms of denying service to agencies' personnel, or agency systems. So they are recovering. But in some cases, if a laptop or a system is being infected with malicious software, there's a process and a cost associated with trying to bring that system back up. Yes?
There's another way to look at this data. If that's 1% denial of service is for, let's say, all federal government, the impact, I think you have to understand the impact of this stuff, as opposed to just saying there's so much malicious code that might have very little impact.
Right, you're absolutely, the scope and impact of a denial of service attack could be rather significant, just as can perhaps, the installation of malicious code, depending upon what information is affected, what systems are affected.
Do you guys measure the impact, or does anybody report the impact? I would think that'd be important, because obviously the impact of it, when you have your company to decide in terms of risk where you would spend your money.
Well, that's exactly right, and that's a very good point. And indeed, my understanding is when agencies report these incidents, that there are some data elements related to what the impact is, the scope of the incident as well. And this is all information that agencies are required to report to the U.S. CERT, so this, which is run out of DHS. And so this information, the source of this, is coming from U.S. CERT reports. But thank you, good questions.
But I think the point
Yeah.
is we never really see the impact on it. I used to work for a consulting company that worked for the financial sector, and we would go to banks, and the banks would say, well, I'm losing $10 million out of my ATMs from whatever kind of but if it's going to cost me $100 million to get the security to do it, then I don't care.
Right.
You get my point? So the $10 million impact for them was acceptable across their banking system. Now, what's acceptable in of loss of critical information or classified information and all that stuff in government's obviously a different animal, but we get the scare tactics, as I think what Peter was bringing up, is we get the scare tactic of we're being attacked by China and all these other places, but we don't really see the impact of it to make appropriate decisions on what we should spend our dollars on, other than these kind of results. So I think that's what we're asking is, are we able to correlate this to the 5,500 you had 4 years ago, the 45,000, yet the systems are still running just fine. So
Right. Yeah, one hopes. Right. Right. Sure.
my point.
Right.
Okay, so we're not reporting all this stuff because we've been sold all the tools from the commercial sector to figure it all out. But the result is my email's still going through. I'll still be able to get to my data on SharePoint. I'll still be able to.
Yeah, from a denial of service, you're absolutely right. The impact is key to this, and that's one of the key functions of the agencies, is what they are to assess as they perform and implement their information security program. And that's assessing the risk to their systems and to their information. And risk is pretty much a function of threat, vulnerability, and impact. To what extent are threats able to exploit vulnerabilities to an agency's systems and their information, and then what's the resulting impact. And that whole equation, agencies need to assess and address as they determine what controls and safeguards and procedures and practices they need to implement to protect their information. And it really depends upon a number of factors on what the information is going to be affected. But no, your point's very well taken, and that's a key element of an agency's, or should be a key element of an agency's information security program. Yes, sir.
To follow up on that, I noticed that 26% is under investigation.
Yes.
How is that defined? And I guess where I'm going with that is, are we now sensing that we've been attacked or someone's on our network and we can't figure out if they're really there, what's going on, and it's open under investigation? Or is it just now there's so many things that we're looking at, we just haven't had the time to really figure out what's going on?
I would not characterize, I would say it's the definition of under investigation is the former rather than the latter. And I don't know if agencies are specifically reporting, well, there's so many going on, we can't figure it out type of thing. But there are some requirements or responsibilities for reporting these incidents in a timely manner to U.S. CERT. And so part of this is something may be underway, we haven't determined the scope of it yet. So I would say it's probably former versus the latter. Any other questions? Good, thank you. And so as you can see, there are different categories here, but the main ones we were talking about is probably, at least in terms of the number, not necessarily the impact. Points well taken deals with malicious code and unauthorized access, as well as improper usage. So there are now several, of course, and many of you are probably very familiar with these, several initiatives underway within the federal space to address and improve security across the federal government. Many of you are familiar with the configuration baselines of the U.S. government, initially implemented under the Federal Desktop Core Configuration Initiative, in which relatively strong, or at least a common set of standardized security configurations were established for Windows operating systems, and they were to be installed on agencies' workstations across the department. Some agencies have included that in their servers as well that operate those operating systems. Tick Einstein, I think we heard Bobby talk about it this morning, and also Peter yesterday evening a little bit about Einstein and Tick and how that is being implemented. As Bobby mentioned, the goal there is to reduce the number of external access points to external networks for each of the agencies. One of the reviews we did about a year or 2 years ago took a look at the implementation of Tick and Einstein, and one of the weaknesses that we identified dealt with just those those actual trusted internet connections. One of the benefits, security benefits and goals of Tick was to reduce the number of access points and then make them hardened to protect the data that's going through there with the goal of having stronger security. But one of the issues that we identified was that DHS, who had the role of actually testing and evaluating the security over those access points, kind of had some weak security controls or methodology in terms of actually assessing the security over those access points. I think it had identified about 40 or so critical security elements that each of these points were to implement, but its review evaluation process or methodology dealt primarily on interviews, maybe some particular checklists to look at, and in many cases, it would not look at each of the designated access points at a particular agency. It would just look at one, and then if the agency said, well, it's a mirror image of the other one's a mirror image of the one you reviewed, it wouldn't look at it, which may be fine, but from an auditor perspective, you know, and looking at it independently and objectively, if we're putting all of our traffic going through these connections, not only is there the benefit of actually improving security, but there's also the possibility if adequate security over those connections isn't very good, of increasing the risk to your information as it goes through there. And so we made some recommendations, and DHS has taken actions to try to strengthen their evaluations of the agency's access points. The Information System Security Line of Business program, this is initially run out of OMB. A number of agencies are participating in this in terms of where a particular agency has done a pretty good job in providing, say, training or reporting under FSMA, that other agencies can go to that agency to have that service provided for them. And it will help to cut down on some of the duplication of efforts that agencies may be encountering on certain standardized security activities. The PIV card is another access control issue, or not access control issues, but another initiative which is intended to improve the security to federal facilities as well as to their systems. That's well underway. We also issued a report on that earlier this year that showed that all the features of these cards were not being fully implemented by the agencies for a number of different reasons. But indeed, it is intended to help improve both physical access as well as logical access to agencies' information systems and facilities. Another key initiative within the federal government deals, yes?
How successful is the rollout of the contact pool? I know that a couple of years ago, people were in this crowd were debating, the year that was finally deployed.
Well, what we found, what we found is that, for example, just that for most of the agencies that we looked at, and we looked at this particular one, 8 agencies, and these were the same 8 that we examined. I think it was back in 2006 or 2007 when this program was a couple years going in and assessing the progress. And the agencies are still having issues. For the most part, agencies have conducted the required background investigations, and for the most part, they have issued cards to their employees and contractor workforces, but there are a number of challenges with that. A couple agencies, and I think agriculture was one, where they stated it was difficult to get cards out to their employees that are out in remote locations. And because there's a process that you have to go through, including fingerprinting and that, where it wasn't readily available to those individuals that might be firefighters out fighting forest fires and somewhere. And so there are some challenges associated with that. But generally, agencies were pretty far along and made significant progress in actually issuing the cards. Where we found less significant progress, if you will, had to do with using the electronic capabilities of the card to either restrict or monitor and control physical access to the facilities, even though that was further along than the use of those electronic capabilities for logical access to an agency's information system. And pretty much the fourth key component of that was the use of those cards for interoperability among federal agencies, where I can use that card and go over to another department and it would be accepted and allow me access to the agency or whatever. And we found that that was at the very low end of the implementation scale, if you will. You have a question? Good. Sure.
I'm curious, along that same vein, what is the GAO ultimately want to see with the use of this card? Because I can tell you that unless there's a very strong mandate that comes down,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to, as a security professional within my organization, I'm going to have to maintain two different authorization systems or authentication systems. One for state card and one for local login. Because without something with a lot of keys, I can't, I'm not going to be able to require my users to only use this card. Because the integration of personal ability, they're going to have the ability to get into their system, to get into their application, so they get the card permanently. They don't put that together.
Yeah, that was a reason that several agencies have indicated as a reason why their progress in implementing some of the electronic capabilities of the cards has been slow, if you will. And indeed, along with just the cost of installing and deploying the infrastructure to accommodate that. But it's not so much GAO's view or what we want agencies to do. You know, as an auditor, what we typically do in our reviews are looking at, well, what's the criteria by which we're going to evaluate an agency's operations or practices. And so it's not so much GAO, but it's more what's the federal guideline and requirement. OMB has set up some requirements for agencies to implement these cards. HSPD 12 itself had, in some of the NIST guidelines, had additional requirements for agencies to implement and use these cards as far as their goals in doing that. So we assessed according to that criteria. But certainly it's OMB's desire, if you will, to implement these cards and the functionality of the cards throughout the agencies. I met with the federal CIO just on Friday, and this was one of the areas that he talked about as an area that was of importance to him, was the implementation of HSPD 12. But thank you for the question. Good question. And yes, please.
So GSA stood up the managed service office 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to service all of the users who did not want to stand up their own system. We've got just over 90 agencies, departments, boards, and commissions that we service for HSPD 12. We have just over 300 stations across the country, and we're working on streamlining the process to address the issue of USDA having a employee in every county in the United States and their ability to get their card. So we're working on some technology issues to try to make that simpler. But the challenges that the agencies are having, depending upon the agency and the department and where they stood in their IT infrastructure, with budgets getting tight, if they were behind the curve, it's going to be that much more difficult for them to comply with the executive order to get their systems up and running to whatever standard they need to meet. And then you get to the challenges of each agency. You may have a secretariat or a department, office of the secretary that may not have a lot of teeth in his organization, or he may, to be able to implement policy down the chain. So there's a lot of different challenges that each one of these agencies have to meet and overcome, but the presidential director is still there.
Right. Thank you. And we have several other initiatives, or the federal government has several other initiatives. I think you're probably familiar with many of these. One on the automated monitoring capabilities, Cyberscope and Cyberstat. This is a relatively new initiative that OMB and the former CIO created, and it's going to be continued under DHS. I believe is taking the lead on this. And then in addition, NIST has been over the last year and will continue to issue some additional information and new guidelines for its risk management framework. And then also there are a number of bills pending before Congress that are addressing information security. I think Bobby addressed that pretty well this morning in response to a question in terms of what the stat of that, or the status is of that particular effort. I know we saw the first cue. I have 15 minutes left. And so what I want to do is just briefly kind of go through some of our recent reports, and I believe that these slides will be made available to everyone participating in this conference. And these are just a number of reports that we have issued over the last couple years, or over the last year, over a number of different areas. One we just issued about last week or the week before last had to do with cybersecurity and human capital and the efforts underway at the 8 departments with the largest IT budgets in the federal government, as well as looking at some of the government-wide initiatives addressing different aspects related to cybersecurity workforce. As you know, without the people actually administering and implementing these systems, they're just a vital cog in the ability for an agency to protect their systems. We also recently issued a report, and actually this was a testimony that I testified at last month over some of the security implications of cloud computing. This is been an issue and one of the initiatives of the administration over the last couple of years. And in our work in examining cloud computing security, we went out and queried and surveyed the key security officials at 24 CFO Act agencies. And 22 out of the 24 agencies came back and said that they were either concerned or very concerned about security in a cloud computing environment, and had developed different ways of trying to mitigate that concern. And so there's a lot of attention being given to this particular area. And I'll be happy to talk more about that as well. But just to get through the slides, there are other issues or other reports that we've issued related to, this is just our FSMA report on the next one, which kind of gives the overview of the data that I just provided on the earlier slides and gives a government-wide view of information security. We talked about the personal ID verification cards. This is a report we issued earlier this year. We also have issued reports at specific agencies, for example, FDIC, Defense Department, also looking at cybersecurity issues as it relates to protecting critical infrastructure. And then also, this is one I just wanted to point out too, we looked at the State Department's implementation of its continuous monitoring application and program called iPost. And what we found is that state's implementation of this capability really resulted in a number of benefits for it. It provided a lot of very useful information on identifying and then resolving known vulnerabilities. Their staff seemed to be very motivated in using these tools to identify and try to enhance security. And so there are quite a number of very positive aspects of State Department's implementation of this capability. At the same time, though, they did have some challenges in doing so, some of which had to deal with technical limitations in their data collection tools. Other had to do with some of the internal processes on how they were actually implementing the tool in terms of making sure that the data was completely accurate and reliable. For a large extent it was, but there were some vulnerabilities and weaknesses that we've identified and made some recommendations to. But all in all, what State Department has done has been kind of leading in the federal government in terms of actually identifying these vulnerabilities on a regular basis and then putting a prioritization and prioritizing those vulnerabilities for the purposes of resolution. And they've done, certainly a very commendable job in leading the way on that. Other engagements that we've issued recently, another one on DoD cyber efforts, particularly as it stands up its cyber command, had a report out on social media in which we found that at the time we did that review, 23 out of the 24 agencies had a presence out on either Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and it was kind of mixed in terms of how the agencies were updating and implementing policies related to managing the records and the information that they either exchange or receive through these technologies, and also updating their security policies, conducting privacy impact assessments, as well as then implementing the appropriate security mechanisms for the safe use of these technologies. And we had other reports related, again, to cybersecurity. It's a key area for a number of our requesters. And then IRS and a couple of other reports. Each of these are available on our website at www.gao.gov, and certainly they're available for your review and comment. If you have any questions about them, my name is on each of them, my phone numbers. Feel free to contact me. Next thing I just want to touch base on are the areas that we're presently working on and some of the engagements that we're working on now or will be shortly. We break them out in a number of different areas. One are FSMA related, where we'll be conducting and are conducting information security control reviews at EPA and Census, in which our objectives there are to assess the effectiveness of the agency's information security controls to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of its information and systems. We look at various different emerging issues, including, well, the report we just issued on cybersecurity human capital. We're also looking at the IT supply chain and IT supply chain risk management at the national security agencies, which would be Department of Justice, Defense, Homeland Security, and Energy. Looking at the cybersecurity risk associated with implantable medical devices. As you may know, they're like defibrillators and insulin pumps and others now contain microchips and that are communicated with through wireless technology. So what are the security risks? How is FDA in its pre- and post-market risk analysis and monitoring capabilities assessing and reviewing those particular risks? And as well as what are those risks and trying to enumerate what those risks are in there. Also, we'll be looking at the cyber threats to the DoD industrial base. We have a whole body of work related to the consolidated financial statements, which we talked a little bit earlier about relative to the overall number of agencies with weaknesses and either material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in their financial system controls. Jumping over to the other side, we have a body of work in which we look at critical infrastructure, IT infrastructure, and systems. What we're looking at here are, that's kind of new and just starting, is the federal role and looking at the datacom network security. And these would be the ones, the data communications and telecommunications networks that are run by the commercial providers. And how is the federal government, FTC or FCC, DHS, interacting with them to help those companies and providers protect their communications networks? Similarly, we'll be looking at the security vulnerabilities that have been identified, what are the risks, and what are the protections that are being designed into consumer IT products, such as iPhones and iPads, that are all leading the move towards a more mobile computing within the federal government. So we'll be taking a look at that aspect of it as well. Moving up, we have a privacy portfolio where we look at the privacy aspects of different programs. One has to do with taxpayer privacy protections that we are working on at the IRS. We're also looking at electronic prescriptions and how is the information that is being used by pharmacies, health information exchanges, and others being protected from both the security and privacy view. And we're also, we'll be starting an engagement soon on the privacy location-based information, like through the use of GPSs or cell phones that may have apps that will allow someone to track your movements. And how is that data being collected? What is it being used for? Is it being collected, and by whom? Yes?
Are you guys looking into electronic privacy issues, like smart computers and stuff?
That might be part of it. We're just starting, and the full scope of this has yet to be looked at. We have looked at smart grid security previously, particularly when we had some recommendations to NIST in terms of some of the guidance that might be needed on that, and which I believe NIST may have already implemented or have developed some of that guidance. But that's a definite possibility that we might be looking at. But the scope is not yet determined. Please.
How concerned is GAO, and I guess Congress, in terms of e-discovery?
That's kind of a big issue with data mining, and that's one of the issues we're looking at just with the prescribing engagement, is to what extent is this data that's being collected, is it being de-identified? So in terms of personally identifiable information, being de-identified for uses other than direct clinical care of that individual. And so that's I think that's something that will be very important going forward, and looking at the big data environment and looking to see how can agencies use data from a number of different databases and for what purposes. And so we're touching on that in a kind of a small way, if you will, in a couple of our engagements, but there's certainly a potential for additional work in that area. It is, it can provide tremendous benefits to government programs to have access to this data in order to discharge their responsibilities, and certainly from a law enforcement and regulatory framework. But there are certainly privacy and civil libertarian concerns as well, and those need to be addressed. But good questions, thank you. And so that's kind of like the set of engagements that we're working on now and we'll be continuing to work on. And so I just had some other questions, wondering if we're going to get through in time, but I'm really glad we had this dialogue throughout my presentation, because that's really what this is, the way I look at this presentation is all about. But I kind of wanted to know from you, and what are your biggest challenges on one side? And then also looking, if you're familiar with GAO products or your agency IG products, are they helpful? How can they be improved? Because we too are always looking for ways to make more meaningful recommendations. Are we looking at the right topics? And being able to help you perform your job. And other than, don't come near us, do you have something else that might be helpful? Anything. And I'll just throw it out to any of you, please. Yes?
The reason I asked the e-discovery question is because as we move out into the cloud, obviously most of us are going to be keeping our cloud in the country, but as we move out into the cloud, the data is stored elsewhere, and we now have international laws that are clear,
Right.
and we have privacy rights and the like. I think that's a large. I'm with DOJ, so it's very important in terms of our role in terms of both for the prosecution and for the defense. And so that's a kind of a big concern for us, because we're not really sure how we're going to manage this in the cloud. And I'm just wondering, the reason I asked that question is Congress and you all really energize in that area to find out if this.
No, that's an excellent question. In terms of our specific engagements, we don't have one looking at that right now, to my knowledge. But certainly that is a big issue, particularly not just from e-discovery, from a legal, for court cases and the like, but also just the handling of personally identifiable information and what happens if there are privacy breaches. My understanding is that there are each of the 50 states may have different laws that agencies will have to contend with. So there's certainly quite a bit of a number of different issues associated with the use of cloud computing, where the data is going to be stored and how it's going to be managed. But that's a very good question, and I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer in terms of, we've been on top of that, looking at that issue. We have not yet. A good point. Thank you. Somebody in the back.
We have time for one short question. Go ahead.
And which department are you with? Oh, USDA, okay. Mhm. Mhm. Right. Yeah, I think it just, both of these points just underscore the need to really thoroughly consider the implications of going to a cloud environment. It's kind of like what technology often precedes and policy, and it's important with the use of social media, the use of cloud computing technologies, and going to even mobile computing. There's always this rush to go into these types of technologies because they can provide significant benefits from a business perspective, perhaps. But we need to go in with our eyes open, and we need to consider thoroughly and thoughtfully what the implications are, because there are likely to be implications that were not thought of. Just for example, with the gentleman's comment on e-discovery, and that, there are a number of issues that could certainly arise that need to be considered as federal agencies move into this domain.
All right, Greg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to be actually serving lunch in this room, so if y'all want to, they're going to be bringing it out, so you can stay where you are, but there may be some hustle and bustle, but we need about 10 minutes to kind of set it up.